LiveFlow saves me 14 hours a month. Terrell Turner, TL Turner Group. LiveFlow saves me 2 working days a month. Michael Alleman Business Group. We're saving over 15 hours a month using LiveFlow. Marissa Stillwell, Bookkeep. LiveFlow has given us the gift of time back. Sarah Jones, Ascent CFO. Stay tuned to hear more from our sponsor LiveFlow later in the episode.
If you'd like to earn CPE credit for listening to this episode, visit earmarkcpe.com. Download the app, take a short quiz, and get your CPE certificate. Continuing education has never been so easy. And now, on to the episode.
This is Oh My Fraud, a true crime podcast where the crazies slash prices instead of people. I'm Caleb Newquist.
And I'm Crazy Greg Kite.
Crazy Greg, you're older than me.
Yeah. Barely. Like a week. Maybe 2 weeks. Maybe a decade. Somewhere around there.
About 200
weeks? A little
weeks?
bit older.
Maybe about 200 weeks.
But maybe possibly
300?
240 weeks older than you.
Yeah, but not much older. So, like, to explain, I grew up in the 80s, but I don't really remember them. You know, I remember the presidential election in 1988, but I don't remember. Oh God, this is awful. But I remember the Challenger exploding. I remember that.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's a traumatic thing for 80s kids.
But like, what do you remember about? Do you remember the 80s well?
Yeah, absolutely. The 80s was really, I was born in the 70s, but I was a child. So I graduated in 1990. So the 80s really, if you think about it, that was my decade. So yeah, I remember, if you want to talk about presidents, I do remember when Ronald Reagan was elected in 1980.
Okay.
I remember that. So the whole thing, I remember, I guess hip hop really began technically before the 80s, but I remember that catching steam. And even in high school, I had a buddy who was like, he pulled me aside, like, we're the last class to know rock and roll. And I'm like, are we? But that was his, he felt like Run DMC was going to trample out, the Scorpions, to a thing of the past. So I remember the 80s.
Right.
I remember the neon colors.
Nice.
It's all there.
Nice. And you grew up on the West Coast. For people who don't know,
Yep, I'm a West Coast boy.
Mount Lake Terrace, Washington, right?
Mount Lake Terrace, Washington, just north of Seattle, a little bit north of Seattle. That's where I grew up. That's home for me.
Right. Okay. Cool. So, do you remember any local television commercials from your youth? Anything that stands out, like a plumber or a mattress company or a personal injury attorney?
It's so funny because I absolutely do remember there being a vendor of some sort of product that had the ubiquitous, annoying advertisements that everybody knew, and everybody kind of, you could insert it into a conversation and everybody knew who you were talking about and was like, oh, that guy in his dumb commercial. The funny thing is, I can't remember the name. I can't even remember what he was selling. I'm thinking maybe furniture, but I'm likely wrong with that. But everybody knew him. Nobody liked him. But apparently his commercials worked. And it's funny because one thing I do remember is I remember talking to my mom because I was young enough that I was like, Mom, why would this guy pay money to put commercials where he's just an asshole? And my mom was like, because people remember that. And I'm like, oh, okay.
And that broke your brain.
So that's why I turned out. It broke my brain a little bit, yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully a listener from the Northwest recognizes this extremely vague description that you gave about
right.
a product that you don't remember, a guy you don't remember, and I know what he's talking about. and they'll email us. They'll be like,
they might, because
was
it this guy? Yeah,
was
it
that?
Him.
Was that the guy? Yeah, right. Okay. Anyway, so amazing story as always, Greg. I ask all these questions because today, in this episode of the podcast, we're focusing on a business whose ads took the East Coast by storm in the late 70s and 80s. And I'm talking about Crazy Eddie, Crazy Eddie was an electronics retailer on the East Coast, and anyone our age, Greg, who grew up in that region, that includes New York City, New Jersey, Long Island, even down to like Philadelphia. Dan Taylor, Professor Dan Taylor, grew up in Delaware, and he remembered Crazy Eddie commercials when I asked him about it on that episode of the podcast.
Yeah.
Everyone remembers Crazy Eddie.
Yep.
And so, and if you don't know Crazy Eddie and you've never seen one of these commercials, please go to YouTube and just watch Crazy Eddie commercials for however long you need to, because they're amazing.
Did.
I did, yeah.
You did this.
I did do it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
But they're amazing. They're amazing in terms of their their annoyance and kind of the way that they really like grab you by the lapel figuratively. The way they bash you over the head figuratively.
Yeah.
And they always ended with the slogan, Crazy Eddie's prices are insane.
That they did. And what was behind all these insane prices, Greg?
An insane fraud was behind them, Caleb.
Yeah, there was. And on the show today, we have a journalist who knows virtually every detail of it, Gary Weiss. Gary has a new book out. It's called Retail Gangster, The Insane Real-Life Story of Crazy Eddie from Hatchet Books. It's out now wherever you get books. And this was a great conversation, huh, Greg?
It was fantastic. I loved it. It was great talking to Gary, and it just, like you said, his encyclopedic knowledge of this case and about frauds in general, and just getting to know about his personal history and how he got to reporting on frauds. So without any further ado, let's get to it. Here's us talking with Gary Weiss.
And that's where I started writing about business.
Was there a story? What would you consider like your first big business story? And I guess kind of follow up, was there like a first big fraud story that you got to cover that really blew your skirt up?
Well, I didn't really write about fraud when I was, starting out. I went to Barron's after a time, and I didn't really write about fraud then. I in the book I talk about a story that was written about the Crazy Eddie IPO. It was a great story. It really sort of gave Eddie a lot of trouble because the reporter read the prospectus. Can you imagine reading a prospectus? The reporter read the prospectus and determined that this was what is this? What is this piece of shit that's coming out of pardon my French? Please delete
You
it.
can curse. That's fine.
What is going on? What is going on at this Crazy Eddie? Well, I was at Barron's I believe I was at Barron's when that article came out, but I had nothing to do with it. I was assigned to like beginner type stuff, like writing about, I don't remember, like writing about little companies, At Barron's, stories were either favorable or unfavorable, that was determined by the editor. We'll do a favorable, we'll do an unfavorable story. I was assigned generally favorable stories. I wasn't assigned unfavorable stories. If you were assigned to favorable stories and it turned out to be unfavorable, this was not what they wanted. I actually remember going out to a cattle and land company out in New Mexico. Great trip. My first exposure to New Mexico. I loved New Mexico. I mean, that was the main thing. That was the only thing I got out of that trip. I didn't got no story. See, I determined that this company was called Oppenheimer Industries. This was a piece of garbage. It's selling land to people without water rights. You can't do it. What are you doing? What the hell is going on? You can't do it. So I turned in this rather negative story, and no. You can't do it. I'm not talking about this. Is a great company. No, so they didn't run it. I went out to New Mexico for nothing, but I really like New Mexico, and I've been back a bunch of times. Okay. That's all I got out. So that was like a sort of an abortive fraud piece. The company that I wrote about, I wouldn't exactly say it was fraudulent, but it was really on the up and up, as we used to say. I really only started writing about fraud after I got out of Barron's, when I was at Business Week. And then I would say this was in the 80s, sometime late 80s. Then I started writing about chicanery on Wall Street, schemes and penny stocks and all that kind of stuff. It's a long way of getting to that, but that's, where I finally arrived kind of at Business Week.
Yeah. So penny stocks. When nowadays, when somebody mentions penny stocks, you're talking like Wolf of Wall Street kind of era. That sort of boiler room tactics, selling the sky, promising the moon, and selling them a piece of shit.
That kind of thing. I remember one story I did. One of the earlier stories I did. I remember was about a company called Sequential Information Systems, which had like 20,000 shareholders. I was really stunned by the fact that 20,000 shareholders was selling for like a 1/20th of a cent. This to me, and this to me was really very interesting. And it was still in existence. And I did a story on this company, and it was actually quite an interesting story. That was, I think, possibly might have been certainly one of my first stories on fraud. I think the CEO went to prison. I don't quote me on that. I'm not sure, but anyway, that stands out in my mind as a really interesting fraud type, sleaze type story. Another was actually about how major brokerages, Charles Schwab and Donaldson, Lufkin, and Jenrette, how they were engaged in these sort of weird slimy profit-making schemes in the back offices, which I'm not going to describe. It's very boring and it's very esoteric. But nevertheless, they were doing something really sort of crummy in the back offices. Their reorganization departments were doing this. And don't ask me to explain to you what a reorganization department is. So that was like my first sort of big negative story on a Wall Street firm. And that was 1990. It seems a very long time ago, isn't it?
And that was at Business Week?
How did that
still at
how did that make
It's
you
amazing to believe that I'm only 42 years old. I mean, I was 10 years old when I was doing these. That was in Business Week. That was in Business.
Okay, business.
quite a prodigy?
I'm a prodigy, and I remember Prodigy.
Yeah, absolutely. So when it sounds like Crazy Eddie got on your radar pretty early on.
No, it didn't.
Was there anything?
Let me disabuse you of that notion. Crazy Eddie only got on my radar, as you put it, in my dotage. This got on my radar just within the past, which for me is like a minute, 15 years. That Crazy Eddie got on my so-called radar screen. That's when I was aware that the company existed, and I was also aware of its travails when they were occurring, because who couldn't be aware of Crazy Eddie and who couldn't be aware of the travail? But I only got interested in Crazy Eddie actually about 10, 15 years ago when I was like maintaining a blog. That's where I ran into Caleb, I believe. I was writing about Overstock.com and the absolute craziness, if you pardon the expression, of the CEO and of their business methods and of the whole mess Overstock.com was. And Sammy Antar, and this was around, I would say, 2007 or 2000. Yeah, I think it was 2007, I believe it was. It's in the book. It's in the, I'd have to look it up. Sammy Antar posted a comment, which I turned into a blog post, in which he wrote a sarcastic letter to the CEO of Overstock, Patrick Byrne, who nowadays is known for his sort of larger scale wackiness and his election conspiracies. But in those days, he was known mainly for being a crazy CEO. And Sam wrote the sarcastic email to, it was a sarcastic open letter to Patrick Byrne. And that's how I sort of got to know Sam. And over time, I got sort of interested in his history and on the history of Crazy Eddie. That was like around 2007, 2008. That's after I'd left Business Week and going on to other things.
So, but did you ever? I'm just curious about this. Did you ever buy anything from a Crazy Eddie store? Did you like get a VCR or a stereo? Like, because it seems like, because I think in the book, like, which I really enjoyed, by the way, and the book. The book makes it seem like, because I was very young and I grew up in the Midwest, so I had I have no sense of Crazy Eddie, but it was really a phenomenon. And it sounds, and like when you describe, and you describe like the grand openings of some of these new stores, and like 20,000 people show up, like that's
like,
insane. If pardon the pun,
mania.
it's not a pun, but whatever it is. But so I'm just curious. So did you as a regular consumer, did you get caught up in the phenomenon that is Crazy Eddie? And it's like, I need a VCR, so I'm going to Crazy Eddie.
No, I never set foot in one of those stores.
Is that right?
I dream of setting foot in a Crazy Eddie store. I mean, who would do this? I mean, I was repelled by the commercial because for part of the time I was in Connecticut,
Yep.
But Crazy Eddie, no, I hated those commercials. And I, unlike a lot of people, even though when I hated the commercials, I did not patronize the store. I just didn't go in. I went someplace else because I didn't trust Crazy Eddie as a consumer. It never dawned on me that there was all this absolute horror show taking place behind the scenes. That never occurred to me.
Right. So to just going back just a second to something that you mentioned and to give a little context to the listener. So Sammy Antar was the accountant, the CFO for Crazy Eddie. He got busted with everybody else. After all this stuff with Crazy Eddie goes down, you said he wrote a sarcastic letter to the CEO of Overstock. Was it like, hey, great earnings report. Looks like you're really doing great. How can I buy some share? Was it... What was the tone and how ballsy is that to be a fucking felon and calling somebody else out?
Well, he was an expert accountant, So his letter, I did quote from it in the book. I could read to you, but his tone was very deadpan. He says, as a former felon and as the CFO of Crazy Eddie, I admire the way you run your business. It reminds me of the way I was when I was young. It was deadpan. It was sort of that like that. And yeah, and he was CFO of Crazy Eddie, and he was the guy. He was the Joe Valachi of the Crazy Eddie crime family. He was the guy who blew the whistle, and even though the everything had collapsed by the time he became an informant, he was the one who threw all the bad guys in jail. Not just Eddie Antar, who was the CEO of Crazy Eddie, but other people.
So, Caleb, are you good if we get into actually the Crazy Eddie story?
Yeah, absolutely. And I kind of have a question. I'm curious about the Antar family. You describe the first part of the book is you go through a lot of the history of the Antar family, and the history of I think the family is very important to the overall story. Like, I don't think I don't think the reader they won't have as good of an understanding of maybe the motives or the culture of, I think, the Syrian Jews that immigrated to the U.S. Kind of the history of that kind of sets the stage for what Crazy Eddie is to become. But one thing that I'm interested about, because you mentioned Joe Valachi and kind of and Sammy being kind of the Joe Valachi of this particular family, it is important to know the book is retail gangster, but these particular gangsters, unless you left it out of the book, there was no violence of any kind. Like these were they were streetwise guys, but they were business guys. Like they very much knew or understood that this was a way that they could make a lot of money, but they never resorted to violence. They never did those kinds of things that, in terms of like organized crime, like people typically think of, that people kind of associate with organized crime. But these guys, that was a road they did not go down.
No, yeah, that's absolutely correct. That's absolutely correct. And of course, people I think have a fundamental misunderstanding of organized crime because generally the books and so forth emphasize the violence, but organized crime, the essence of organized crime is making money. Any way. And as a matter of fact, as far as regular mafia type organized crime is concerned, as you know, one of the young guys who worked in Crazy Eddie went on to the high level position at the Bonanno crime family, and this guy, he was not a violent kid. He was a very smart kid. He was a very nice kid, and he went into, and I traced his career a little bit. And I found that when he went into the Bonanno crime family, they never nailed him for anything violent. So even when he joined the mafia, this is a Crazy Eddie guy. Even when he joined the mafia, even when he became the street boss of the Bonanno crime family, he still, although I'm sure he committed violence, I mean, of course, they still couldn't nail him for anything violent,
Right.
So there's no violence even in the mafia subplot. In fact, there were two mafia subplots in this because Eddie used to buy from a numbers bank in the Bronx. And again,
Right.
there was no violence there. So, but of course, people I think tend to overemphasize the violent aspects. Well, maybe not overemphasize, but they tend to focus on the violent aspects of organized crime. I mean, that's not what organized crime's about. And Eddie was an absolutely fantastic racketeer in his own way. I mean, he did it just like the mob does. He knew how to manipulate people, and he knew how to make money by cutting corners. And very much as the garment district, the mob in the garment district would exploit the way the garment district was operated. Eddie knew how to make money illegally by exploiting the weird characteristics of the electronics market. And that's how that was sort of behind all this amazing marketing that was saturating the airwaves in the 1970s, 80s.
This episode of Oh My Fraud is sponsored by LiveFlow. LiveFlow connects QuickBooks Online directly to Google Sheets and Excel, allowing you to have spreadsheets that automatically update with the most recent QuickBooks data. Hundreds of accountants, bookkeepers, and small businesses are using LiveFlow today to create automatically updating budgets versus actuals, dashboards, and consolidated reports. Yes, consolidated reports. You can connect one spreadsheet to multiple QuickBooks Online companies and see the numbers updated in real time. Because LiveFlow can be fully customized to create reports and dashboards, LiveFlow could also be used to surface possible fraud. For example, you could create a sheet that is a list report for invoices or checks and filter it for transactions over a certain amount. Then if any questionable transaction is entered into QuickBooks, it would automatically appear on the sheet. Or maybe you get really aggressive and create an entire dashboard that automatically surfaces transactions that are out of company norms. To learn more about using LiveFlow and how you can save 20% off your first 3 months, head over to ohmyfraud.promo/LiveFlow. That is ohmyfraud.promo/LiveFlow. Stop manually updating your spreadsheets with LiveFlow.
So one of the things that I love to do in cases like this, when analyzing these, is I love to try to differentiate like sleazy but legal business versus illegal business. And in the book, when you're outlining, especially Crazy Eddie up to the point of the IPO, some of the things that I mean, when I'm kind of and tell me if I'm forgetting any of the pieces of the puzzle, but his initial way of getting an edge on the market was really simple. It was just not remitting his full sales tax. So he pocketed a lot of sales tax. Obviously, that's illegal.
Man.
You can't do
don't
that.
like it.
And that was it. But then some of the other stuff that you talked about, bait and switch was one of the things where they. But what's interesting, my understanding, and correct me if your understanding is wrong, bait and switch is illegal, but it has to be like egregious, where you say, hey, we've got this stereo for $15, and they never had a stereo for $15, never intended to have a stereo for $15. You come in and go, hey, where's the stereo for $15? And they go, oh, those sold out, buy this instead. Is my understanding of like the illegal aspect of bait and switch incorrect?
No, bait and switch is actually defined pretty broadly in the certainly in the New Jersey and New York statutes. I didn't, that all the other statutes. And in fact, they did nail them for bait and switch at one point in the late 80s, 87. New York City did, but didn't penalize them. Ordinarily, what bait and switch means is that you market a certain. You're marketing something, and when you get there, you don't get it. You're switched away from it. And it doesn't matter whether it's higher price, lower price. In this instance, the statutes are very broadly defined. The question is, are they enforced? And against Crazy Eddie, they really were not.
Okay.
They committed bait and switch by switching customers not to higher price products, because they didn't have that many of those in stock, although they had some. And they didn't make much money on the higher price products. They switched them to lower price products, where Eddie made a much higher profit. But that was, again, that was against the law. That was against the law, but it was like what was a sales practice? I forget exactly. It was not a criminal. I don't believe it was criminal. It was part of the statutes the consumer protection statutes, which are not that consistently enforced. Believe me, in the first place, it's not really criminal. He did a lot of criminal stuff, but that wasn't the bait and switch, which was the foundation of it. And that was not really criminal. Now, but it was illegal.
Right. Okay, let's go to another tactic that they had. Somebody'd come in and they like the salespeople couldn't get them off of the Sony that had just a tiny markup, and maybe the only money they were making was the sales tax they weren't remitting. But then they'd say, "Oh, but you're going to need some speakers, you're going to need some cables, you're going to need this other stuff to go along with that," and all that stuff they would sell at a huge price. I go, that's just upselling it at Gap, and that's not illegal. It might be aggressive, and you're exploiting the consumer's laziness of going, I don't want to go to here, they got it here. I don't want to make another. I don't want to stop at Walmart. So fine, give me that stuff. Right. That's not illegal. It might be aggressive, but not illegal.
No. I mean, the upselling was like one of the things that they emphasized, because the cables and all this stuff were ridiculously overpriced. But no, that's not illegal. That's not even really unethical. They just make a lot of money on them. That's okay.
Yeah.
Actually.
And then the last thing up until sorry, Caleb, do you have something? About that
so what I was going to say was you do a pretty good job talking about this in the book as it relates to the commercials, right? And I spent the last 30 minutes watching crazy Eddie commercials to prepare myself for this conversation. but in those commercials, and you mentioned in the book, and then I heard it in the commercials when I was listening to them, Jerry Carroll, the shouting guy that everybody loves, he says the words, "Go to Crazy Eddie," right? And you talk about in the book is the whole idea behind their marketing tactics or their advertising tactics was just to get the people in the store. And so that's why the bait and switch was the kind of thing, they'd advertise something and somebody like, I want that thing. Then they'd get in the store and they don't have the thing. And so, but they're in the store. And so then, like you say, you sell them the Pioneer or the Sharp instead, you upsell them on all the stuff, but also the subliminal nature of those commercials where it's just like, go to Crazy Eddie, shop around, but then go to Crazy Eddie. That really worked. It really, that the psychology behind that seemed to be really, really effective. And then, like you say, there's nothing illegal about upselling, but they're in the store and they need the stuff. So, focus on selling them all this other stuff while they're here.
Yeah, sure. I mean, the whole idea was to get them in the store, and the other retailers hated Crazy Eddie because their pitch was, come to the store, we will be just shop around, get the best price, and Crazy Eddie will beat it. And that took all the credibility out of their pricing. So, if you did what they say, you'd get a cheaper price, no question. If you really held Crazy Eddie to it, if you couldn't be switched away from what you wanted, they'd sell it to you. They'd show up.
Yeah. So then the next practice again, coming up to the IPO, to their intentions to go public with Crazy Eddie, I thought was so interesting and so fascinating was the insurance fraud that they engaged in. But even that, and it sounded like what they were doing is it's like, okay, here's some stuff that we know, like even like you said about the bait and switch. So if we take the legality out of it, even if what they were doing was horribly illegal with bait and switch, they knew, and I know that stuff's just not enforced. So they're like, good. Same with the sales tax stuff. They know, hey, as long as we're giving them something, they're not going to come and put the screws on us to figure out if we're skimming sales tax. But then the insurance fraud, similar thing where they knew that people weren't enforcing it. Tell us, I'd rather you told it than I try to recount what I remember. But the stuff where they and what they call it, like spiking the claim. What was those particular? So it was spiking. Yeah, tell us about spiking the claim, because I thought that was so.
Well, you got to keep in mind, first of all, this was taking place in New York City in the 1980s, late 1970s, when the city was falling apart. Crime was everywhere. Street crime was everywhere. Burglaries were everywhere. So the storekeepers insured against this. They insured against burglaries. They insured against flooding. And if there was a burglary or if there was a flood, they would just simply put in a claim for stuff that was not stolen and that was not flooded. And when they put in a flood claim, they would actually take merchandise from other stores that weren't selling, and they would put it in the basement of the store that was flooded, and they would hose it down to make it seem like it was damaged. It was damaged goods. As a matter of fact, they would then usually the insurance companies, they didn't want these moldy boxes and anything. So when they would take these moldy boxes, they'd put them in a storehouse, and then when they had the next flood claim, they take out these moldy boxes again and put it back in the basement. They put in another. They'd recycle the same same boxes and the same claims. And I quote them an instance which took place in their store on Fordham Road in the Bronx. Now that's my neighborhood. I know I know the kind of neighborhood that was by the early 80s. It was late 70s, early 80s. It was really pretty dangerous. And so they are. They're committing sort of this white collar crime in a neighborhood which was dominated by blue collar crime. Okay. And at the time there was arson in the Bronx. Half the Bronx was burning down. Even that. And this is something Eddie never did. He didn't burn down anything. He didn't, he put in a fire claim. There was he never committed arson. He never burglarized any of his own places. But you had this sort of the general atmosphere of lawlessness in New York City. And Eddie, was expecting never to be prosecuted for any of this stuff. Insurance companies did generally not investigate and did not generally prosecute suspected insurance fraud. And sure enough, he got away with it. He got away with it.
Right. So and with the spiking of the claims, because like you said, he as far as we know, he never lit anything on fire. He never lit anything on fire. He never like busted a pipe on his own store. It was more like here, and it's funny to me, the flood stuff, very close to home. My day job, I'm the CFO for a group of medical office buildings, so I help manage commercial real estate, and floods are a real thing. They happen to us every few years. It's the worst. That's the worst day of my year when we go in and there's been a flood. So he would just wait for this stuff to occur when the universe says, hey, it's time for this building to flood. But then what he'd do is he'd go, oh, and these Toshibas aren't selling. So they just like throw them in to the basement that's now a swimming pool going, I guess. And the other thing is, you said he would insure it not for wholesale, but for retail. So basically every Toshiba he throws in to the flooded basement, he's like, well, that's a sale, and that's a sale, and here's some other shit we can't sell. So let's just throw it all in and hose it down and piss on it and spit on it. You were saying, I don't know if that was, hyperbole from
that's what they would do, at least according to my source in this. And that seems perfectly legitimate that they would do this. After all, if you're going to commit insurance fraud, we'll do it right. And they would do it right. Pipes always burst in the winter in stores. They always burst. So okay, let's take advantage of it. That's what he thought. But yet at the same time, he had a certain sort of, I wouldn't call it ethics, but there were certain limits, red lines that he wouldn't cross. He would never break his own pipe. As I point out, he would never burglarize his own. So he would never burn down it.
Right. Well, and again, to my mind, looking at all these cases over time, if you're going to be a smart fraudster, if you're going to be like a successful fraudster, you're not. It's the whole the adage of pigs get fat, hogs get slaughtered, where it's like don't swing for the fences, just do enough to line your pockets without going crazy. And that's how you stay under the radar, kind of like what you're saying. So I think that was, like I said, maybe not guided by some sort of moral compass that Eddie had to not burn his own buildings down, but maybe going, that's how you go to jail. This is how you just make some money.
So he got away with the majority of the crimes that he committed, even the pretty serious ones that he committed overseas, which we haven't gotten to yet. No, he was in many respects, but he made certain significant errors as a fraud.
Yeah. So, Gary, I think for me, the line in the book that sums up I think, the entire Crazy Eddie story. And I don't know if you remember writing the sentence and you thought, oh, that's the good sentence. No, but for me, it jumped off the page at me, and it was a very short sentence, but it said, the fraud came first.
I don't
And
actually
I'm
remember that, but the fraud did come first. Sure.
The fraud came first. And and I don't remember if that was, I don't remember exactly the context around it, but that's how Eddie felt about it. And so anytime they had to, and I think this was either in preparation for the IPO or shortly after the IPO, the pressure to see growth, the Antars were very, I guess, innovative. I don't know if innovative is quite the right word, but like they were clever in terms of like, well, what can we do? We're running all these scams and everybody's on board. Everybody's on the team. And Eddie kind of had this way, you know, he's this very kind of dynamic and charismatic figure that people wanted to please, that people wanted to work for. And if he said the fraud came first, then then people were on board. They did it. And so I wonder, what do you think? It's kind of like, it's kind of a surprising thing that was just the overall culture within Crazy Eddie, is that we have to do these things in order to grow the company, to keep it going. And I'm just curious, is that how you see it? Was the fraud, with the culture of, was it just simply a culture of fraud, and that's what kept it going? And do you think, is that something that you see today? Are there businesses today that kind of have a similar approach in your mind?
Well, I think it was a culture of fraud at the highest levels. Eddie was very careful not to bring into frauds people he couldn't trust, to keep their mouths shut and to do what he wanted him to do. So it was in some respects a little bit like Madoff with his, what was it, the 17th floor or whatever it was, and Madoff compartmentalized the fraud. There was a certain area where the fraud was committed. While it's true that there were things that were so nice taking place, outside Eddie's immediate circle of friends and whatever, nevertheless, at the highest levels where the accounting fraud, the big public company frauds were conducted, that was conducted in a very limited fashion among people he could trust who did not necessarily always know that they were committing frauds. And this was true in some of the stuff they was doing in the warehouses, where I go into two particular individuals. One was honest, one was dishonest. There was one guy who participated in warranty frauds where they were putting in claims for warranties that did not exist, and this guy was basically a crook. And but even he didn't quite understand the accounting game that Eddie was playing in the warehouses. And then there was another guy who was really pretty honest, and he committed very much the same fraud in a different set of warehouses. So I would say that Eddie was constantly testing people to find out, can he bring these people up in the company to work with him on the frauds that he had in mind. He was always testing people, and if you didn't pass the test, then you didn't get into that circle of intimates.
Yeah. Okay, so let's move on, because like I said, the stuff I talked about before in terms of the stuff that was legal, stuff that wasn't legal, that's not even the stuff that Crazy Eddie's known for. So walk me and the listener through, like I'd say just big picture. They're coming up to the IPO. I guess there was a light bulb that came on with Sammy, the CFO, and he was like, wait a second, this has all been great, and we're doing fine, but the way for us to get like rich is to go public with the company. But then he was a good accountant. I think that's by all accounts. He was good at that. Walk us through I guess maybe the major beats in the story, just because some listeners have probably never even heard of Crazy Eddie. Yeah. So yeah, just walk us through the major beats of the story from now. We're gonna get on the IPO, how they did that, what happened, what they had to do to please the stock market, and then how it collapsed.
Eddie and the company had been skimming cash. The company had been skimming cash and sending it mainly to Israel, to bank accounts in Israel. They've been skimming cash for a long time, and cash skimming, they called it nechti, among the Syrians called it nechti. Skimming cash was just part of their business, part of the business practices that the Antar family had been doing for many years. You do that, to cheat the tax man. So Sammy Antar, who was the first trained accountant in the family, he pointed out to them, hey, look, we want to go public at a certain point. Why don't we skim less and less cash from the company? Because the less you skim, the more your profits increase. We're decreasing our profits right now, so we pay less taxes. But if we cut down gradually on the amount of skim, it's going to make it seem as if our profits are really increasing. And that's exactly what they did. So when they went public in 1984, they looked, wow, this is a growth story. This is marvelous. And really, the main thing that was driving their profits was the fact that they were just skimming less. They just were manufacturing the profits. So that was the first. That was the first element that brought them into the IPO, that hoodwinked Wall Street and all of Wall Street and all the major investors.
Right. And I love that so much, where it's like, well, here's this one fraud we've been doing, but if we slowly wean ourselves off of that fraud, that's going to help us do this way more profitable. That's going to enable this much bigger fraud. That's sort of the dumb luck falling, ass over elbow into a good fraud scheme that, again, we see it fairly common in the stuff that we look at. So yeah, continue. I love this stuff.
Look, it made more sense to skim less. Okay, you'll be paying more in taxes. But he was saying, look, it's best to overpay in taxes than under. You actually do better overpaying in taxes and overstating your profits, because the stock market is going to love this, and you're going to be the biggest stockholder, right? So you're going to be able to cash in your stock and make a fortune, And he was right. He was 100% right. So after they went public, because of this phony mechanism that they had of skimming less, it occurred to them, well, we got to keep on committing fraud, because, honestly, if the truth comes out, because we're really not that profitable, and if we have to maintain a facade of fraud, because if we don't maintain this facade of fraud, we're going to have a facade of failure. And we're going to have problems. So they started to boost their profits by boosting the contents of their warehouses, by boosting their inventories. And, the majority of people, I think, are not acquainted with accounting and do not realize that the more your inventory, the higher your inventory, the higher your profits. It's just the way profits are calculated. You guys know, well, majority of people don't know this. So he then had a scheme to boost the contents of the warehouses, which he conducted, he and Sam and the other guys conducted in very crude ways, but they worked very well. They boosted the value of the and they just kept on doing this, and they kept on, that was getting to be a difficult fraud to carry out. So they thought of other ways of doing it. They had cooperative wholesalers, buying stuff from them so that they could boost. They actually sold to wholesalers to increase their profits, because they played games with the dates of the. They played games with the dates of the invoices, so that it would increase their profits, but it would increase it in a sort of a mechanism that made it possible for them to pinpoint which financial statement is going to be inflated, so as to rip off which buyers of which stock they're issuing. They kept on, figuring out new and improved ways of committing fraud. And over time, it became this big headache, because, they fraud after fraud after fraud. And they just, it was just like this big balloon they were blowing up. And it was going to burst. And it burst at a certain point because, and this is the irony here, because after a while they couldn't really sustain the fraud, and their stock price started to decline. The stock price first climbed a huge percent. I think it was like 1,800% or something like that. Their stock climbed up to 1987, and then it started to collapse and went down. So when the stock started to collapse, they didn't want this, but they they started to get a reputation as a wonderful takeover target. This has got to be undervalued. I mean, look how they're declining. This is a great company. We got to buy that. So there's got to attract takeover interest. They don't want to be taken over. If you're committing fraud, you don't want to be taken over.
No. Yeah, because they'll expose all of your shenanigans. The new team for sure.
That's exactly what that.
Yeah. And again, Caleb, this is the story we hear so often, where it's like, this is easy money, and then you go, the next thing you know, it's you're juggling chainsaws, and you can never stop juggling chainsaws, and that's your life.
It's just way too much work. So Gary, I want to ask you a little bit about Sammy, because I think in the book, the dynamic between Eddie and Sammy is very interesting.
Oh, yeah.
And I think, because it seems to me, and I've heard other people say this, but like, it seems to me like Eddie, maybe a sociopath, maybe not. I'm just an armchair psychologist, so who's to say? But he certainly didn't care about hurting people, like while he was in it. Whereas I think one of the things that so you open the book with this scene where Sammy and a couple of the executives are going to see this real rich guy. His name is Milton Petrie.
Milton Petrie.
And so this is at the stage where the Crazy Eddie is potentially a takeover target, and they go to this. They meet Petrie at a club, and they're talking about it. And Sammy goes into the meeting, and you get in this, and this scene is later in the book, but they're there and they're having the conversation, and in the conversation, it dawns on Sammy that this guy Petrie is a really good guy. He was a great business person. He made a huge fortune, and then you have these stories in there about how he would read a story about someone who was down on their luck in the newspaper, and he would find the person and he would take care of them in some way, pay their hospital bills or pay for their kids' education or whatever it was. This was the kind of who this Milton Petrie was. And Sammy is sitting there and he's having this conversation, and the idea that they were going to con this guy into buying the company made Sammy feel queasy. And that's when it dawned on me that like Sammy, who I've known, as long as I've known you, Gary, about 15 years, Sammy has this way of like, he wants you to feel like that he's still the bad guy, and that he's always a bad guy, and that he's a bad guy, but he just got caught. Right. And I think there are moments in the book where he completely sheds that. And this was one of those scenes where he's like, this guy is a good guy. He helps regular people. He made a fortune. He's giving the money away. He's like, Sammy didn't do this deal, at least in part, I think, because he did not want to con this guy. And I just wonder, like, is Sammy, how much, like, and that's the thing I can't figure out about Sammy, is like, how much of it is him, how much of that Sammy, the good, bad Sammy, whatever it is, like, how much of that was him trying to be, he wanted to please Eddie, right? But there was still a voice inside him that said, this is wrong. And so I just wonder, like, is that the conflict within him? And is that the biggest difference between him and Eddie?
Well, yeah, I think you're raising a very good point. I think there was a bit of a conflict between him, and you see this coming out with Petrie. He didn't want to. This is a nice guy. Do I really want to take over this guy? But you have to remember also that after that incident, he continued to do things that really weren't very nice. He was shredding documents, he was committing major crimes and whatever. I think that over time, after he was caught, and after he started to get into religion somewhat, Judaism, became religious, he started to study these things. I think he began to develop a certain amount of real remorse, which I think is what you're seeing nowadays. We're seeing over the past 15, 20, well, actually over the past 30 years, since he testified against Eddie in court. But I think, you're right. I mean, the thing about Eddie that I think distinguishes him from Sam and distinguishes him from the majority of the people, but really sets him, is that he just simply had no conscience. He just didn't care. He'd lie to everyone. He'd steal from everyone. And it was as if the closer you were to him, the more likely you were that he would either turn you into a victim or he would turn you into a perpetrator.
That's Eddie we're talking
Eddie.
about,
No,
not
that's
Sam.
Eddie.
That's Eddie. Yeah.
No, I think Eddie sort of stands out among, I would say among all the other characters in the book. And also he had such a magnetic personality. My God, to this day, people just adore the guy. Former salesmen, former employees, they just love him. They just love the guy to this day.
There was one line in the book. One of my other favorite lines was you said, and I don't remember the context, but the context doesn't really matter because the sentence was, Eddie was not a logical and reasonable person. And I'm like, yeah,
no, he wasn't,
I mean, he just wasn't. And so like you say, he didn't care about who he lied to. He didn't care about who he cheated. And that he maintained that pretty much until probably, I don't know, even until he, in like the stories you kind of, when he eventually is in prison and he's given these jailhouse interviews, he's playing the victim in all those interviews. Like he's saying, it's like, look at me, what I have done. I've done nothing wrong. And he maintained it even after the jig was up.
Yeah, he maintained it until he pleaded guilty, and then he stopped giving interviews. That was it. But I think his character flaws is what eventually did him in. His failure to, the fact that he didn't think logically, the fact that he didn't think of the consequences of what he was doing. Eventually, that's what destroyed him. The way he treated Sammy Antar. If he had paid for the guy's legal bills, and then instead of when you hang out the people closest to you, to hang them out to dry, like your ex-wife, the way he was cheating her, he turned her into an enemy. He turned the people closest to him into an enemy out of sheer vindictiveness and spite. And that ultimately, that is one of the major factors that brought him down eventually. He just screwed over people for no reason and usually got away with it. But then he stopped getting away with it.
What would you pinpoint as because again, we're talking about he's got different kinds of financial statement fraud that have been pulled into play to try to please Wall Street. What's do you feel like you can identify, was it just a death by a million cuts, or can you identify one thing that was like, this was the death blow for Crazy Eddie?
Well, the death blow for Crazy Eddie came in 1,000 cuts, and if it was just an accumulation of various frauds that could not be sustained.
Yeah.
So when the company was finally taken over in a sort of hostile takeover, it was just it was natural. This was right around the time of the 1987 crash, as a matter of fact, just by coincidence. Right around that time, Crazy Eddie was taken over, and they find this complete shambles. They find that their warehouses have been ridiculously inflated. And they find that they go into the CFO's office. The new CFO goes into the office. He finds no files. Where are the files? They've all been shredded. They see this is. Oh God, what did I hear? Oh no, what did we buy here? So that was the end of it. But before that happened, the fraud started to crumble, and it was when the fraud started to crumble, which I would say would have been around early 1986, 85, right around the mid 80s. That's when things started falling apart. And then Eddie started putting his assets overseas. He started to put his money in Israel, because he was under the false impression, if I put my money in Israel, and particularly if I do it through some Panamanian account, they'll never find it. And if they that's a refuge for me, because after all, I'm Jewish. I may not be very religious, but I can immigrate there.
Yeah,
and they can't touch me. That was sort of what was going through his mind, because that's exactly what he did. He put his money, he put all his money, majority of his money in Israel and in Switzerland. So, come on now. I've seen movies about this. Obviously, they can't touch this. I've seen the James Bond movie. It's impossible to penetrate these banks. And he was wrong. The Swiss people cooperated. The Israelis wanted to get rid of him. When he finally fled to Israel under a phony name, He became citizen under his real name. Okay, he can do that. And under his phony name. He didn't think like a logical person. You can't do that. The Israelis aren't going to like that. No, they're not going to like that because Arab terrorists can do that too. They were going to hang this guy. Had they not finally gotten him out of that country, I don't think the Israelis would have treated him very gently. But he just couldn't think things through. I put it as he was a very poor chess player. He couldn't think one or two moves ahead. He didn't quite grasp the consequences of what he was doing, and that's ultimately what ended him. Eddie ran his company, even when it was a very big company, like it was a little shop on 14th Street or Times Square. His methods were crude, I think, and also he was a bit of a micromanager. Though, see, that's the thing about Eddie. Eddie, he micromanaged. He drove his ad guy, his advertising guy, a guy named Larry Weiss. No relation. The guy who brought in Jerry Carroll to do those commercials. I don't know why.
That's not your Uncle Larry.
No. But he brought in this guy to do the advertising, and in fact, Larry Weiss, the guy I'm talking about, he actually brought in Jerry Carroll to do the advertising for Crazy Eddie. But and he was running the ads, and they were pretty successful. And Eddie was driving him nuts by he had to read all the commercials, and there were a lot of commercials. He had to read all the commercials. He micromanaged every little aspect of the. Now, eventually, he kind of let go of that. But even so, up until the very end, he kept particularly on what mattered to him, which was the stock price, which was the fraud. Particularly on that, he was a real hands-on manager on that. Oh no, he didn't delegate any of this. And then what mattered to him on the fraud, he did not delegate. He handled it personally. So for instance, he hired personally a particular investor relations guy. He hired that guy personally. He called him constantly. What is the stock price? What's it today? What's the volume? What's the there was no internet. You had to call people and find out. And anything relating to the fraud, he handled personally. He handled it all. Yeah.
Gotcha. Did you, Caleb? You had an interesting take on the Wall Street PR guy, or at least a kind of a question relating to how things fell apart there.
One of the things, and this is a small thing, but but it also jumped out at me. So the investor relations guy that you mentioned, his name was Ed. I think it's pronounced Colleton.
Colleton, yeah.
Colleton, yep. At one point, Sammy fired him. And Colleton was pretty. So I think but part of the reason Crazy Eddie was so successful immediately after the IPO was of the work that Colleton did, because he was so well connected on the street, knew who to talk to, knew how to hype the stock. I thought it was really interesting because Sammy, when he gets fired, Sammy fires him eventually. And if I remember right, he said Sammy was tired of his picky questions. And you talk about, not being a good chess player. Right. And that's what I wondered is did Sammy just not like him? Because it seems like they owe this guy a lot of the reasons for their success. And Sammy's just like, oh, fuck that. I don't like this guy. He's out.
That's basically it. Yeah, that's basically it. I mean, Eddie Sammy was pretty new at the job, and he was a questionable call when he fired Ed Colleton. Colleton.
Right.
But he didn't like Colleton. I mean, he just because he thought, I sort of allude to this in a very gentle fashion, but Sam is a very, very neat guy, and he's very, something of a neat freak, very good. And Carlton was kind of slovenly, and he was also a drunk, so he just was personal, and it was one of those things where you shouldn't have fired him. He fires him before Christmas in the usual way. They shouldn't have fired the guy. He was doing a great job, but he didn't like him, so they fired him. And you're absolutely right. It's an excellent point. Carlton, who was a totally legit PR guy, investor relations guy, he did a wonderful job, as shilling for Eddie. He did
Yep.
he's an example of the legitimate people who Eddie was able to con into doing his dirty work.
But again, to me that doesn't make to me it makes perfect sense that Sammy'd want him out, especially if he was a legit above board guy who's good at what he does. Like you said, it's picky questions because you're going, I need somebody who's just going to go, hey, great financial statements. Awesome. No follow-up questions. And this sounds like this guy wasn't that because he was good at what he did. Is that incorrect?
Well, the sense I got, my understanding of the situation is that he was personal. He just didn't like it. He was asking picky questions. It's true. Okay. But he was just impatient with him, and he was stupid. In my opinion, why would you hire it? Why would you fire someone who's doing such a wonderful job? Now they wound up hiring another legitimate company, Kext, after that. But Carlton was really doing a fine job, Yeah. But you're right. Yeah. You have a point there. Maybe some of his questions dug into the nitty and gritty, but the way Sam put it, if I recall correctly, I believe his feeling was that the questions were stupid. In other words, that they weren't like incisive questions that were going to find the fraud, but just some stupid questions that you would not expect from a guy of Carlton's experience. But I think it was mainly he just didn't like him. He's drunk. He didn't like him.
One thing that I'm interested in too, where were the auditors in all this situation? Because when you're selling back to wholesalers, that's a red flag. When you're timing invoices to just barely meet Wall Street's expectation, that's a red flag. Inventory stuff, they're supposed to check that, and I know there's sneaky ways to get around that. But do you feel like the auditors? I guess the question is, to what extent do you feel like the auditors are to blame with this going on to the extent that it did?
Well, I would say that the auditors, you have to realize that the auditors were never successfully sued. I don't get into the litigation. I would have had to have written a book of the same length to get into the litigation that followed Crazy Eddie's demise. The auditors were sued by everybody, and the auditors sued in return. And the auditors were never successfully sued over this. There was never any real finding of fault, but the auditors had done some terrible job. I know what Sammy believes they did a crappy job. But nevertheless, that's not the judgment of the legal profession and of the law and the courts. They never really nailed the auditors. The auditors sort of did a crummy job because a crummy job was called for, by the standards of the auditing business. For example, when they were bringing the company public, you send over Oppenheimer and Company. Sent over a couple of bright young auditors. Well, actually, they were not auditors per se, but they were like due diligence guys. Yep. It's the same with the auditors. There's none of these due diligence guys who are really bright. Ivy League, real sharp characters. And they came to this company that's run by some guys from Brooklyn, and everybody's related to one another, and they've got all these internet connections. So they did the best they could, really, under the circumstances. But the fraud, that is to say, the major fraud that was taking place at that time was the reduction in the skim, to enhance the profits. And there was really no practical way they could have determined that. When somebody's lying to you, to your face, if I say to your face, do you realize that there's lava flowing outside? And if I put my hand in, if someone lies to you in a really, really big way, and there's not necessarily any way that you're going to be able to discover that if you don't have the tools or the access to in this case, to their airline records that they're flying to Israel to dump, dumping less. The auditors, over time, they failed to discover. The main problem with the auditors was that they failed to properly, they failed to detect the blatant fraud that was taking place in the warehouses. And, they were supposed to conduct test audits of the contents of the warehouse. And Eddie, Sam was able to find the other people. Sam and the other people simply were able to figure out what they were test auditing. In one instance, they kept their work in a locked box, and the key to the locked box of the auditors was kept in a little box of paper clips. That was noticed. So they went to that box of paper clips. They took the key. They unlocked it. They said, "Oh, so this is what they're conducting the test audits. Oh, I see. Well, we'll be careful with those." So, they conducted tests. They adhered to generally accepted auditing practices or whatever the hell it was. And they still didn't find the audit. So it was like a structural issue, I would say. It's a question of, they're not really... this is not like you're sending Elliot Ness to the warehouse to really find out with assuming that everybody's doing it is a crook, assuming that, and really no, they assume that these are legit people, and if there's a problem, it's just a mistake, come on, and that's what happened when they found stuff that was kind of crummy. Like some of the numbers were really off. I mean, they just assumed it was a mistake. These legitimate people. That was endemic to auditing at that time, and probably today.
Probably, even though as CPAs we have an ethical standard to it's called professional skepticism, which is the exact opposite of what you just described, where it's like you gotta go. These guys are fucking. The assumption needs to be they're fucking with us. So let's go in with that mindset. But you're right. That's not what really happens in real life.
Really. But certainly not at that time. Certainly.
Yeah. So it's interesting too what you said, where you're saying that now Sammy is saying that the auditors did a shitty job. Was he like going, these guys suck so bad they couldn't even find my harebrained fraud? What's his approach on that?
Well, you'd have to talk to Sammy to get his first-hand take on auditors. He has many times written on his website, whitecollarfraud.com. I should tell you where to find it. He is constantly pounded away at auditors and at the accounting profession. That's one of the themes of his writings, and of the speeches that he, gives around the country and whatever, that the auditors they just do a crappy job, and why they do a crappy job. And this is what they did at Crazy Eddie. And so that's a lot of what he's been doing since the Crazy Eddie fraud collapse is doing that.
Gary, congrats on the book.
Thank you.
Should read it. Everybody should read it. It's a great book. It's a great read. It's a great read.
It's wonderful.
I remember when I first came across your blog, and I remember reading your early stuff, but it had been a while. I hadn't read. I'm sorry to say I haven't read any of your other books, but you do have a great style. I think it's a very enjoyable read, and especially for people who are numbers inclined, they'll really enjoy it. But my last question is, what's going on today that feels Crazy Eddie-esque to you? Is there anything out there where you're like, that's, and it can be in any aspect. Maybe it's the familial aspect. Maybe it's the business kind of the attitude about business. I'm just curious if anything feels familiar in this day and age.
Well, I hesitate to get too specific because I really don't feel like defending myself in any sort of libel suit.
Of course, of course.
I really am not, I'm not into that anymore.
Just say Elon Musk, and we'll end the interview.
I mean, like, you see a lot of bubbles out there. You see a lot of meme. Is it about meme or meme?
Memes.
Meme. I didn't even know how to pronounce it. A lot of meme stocks, which reek of fraud. They may not be, but they reek that there's something bad going on here. But the thing with these companies, the things with these with these meme stocks, is unless you really do the deep dive, and unless you get an insider to tell you what's really going on, you can't really find out. I'm sure much can be discovered through careful reading of financial statements, and of course. But to really know who's doing what, to whom, and what's really happening, you need insight. You need whistleblowers. You need insiders, and that's why That's why I somewhat hesitate to, I can tell you what the odor is. I can't tell you what's causing the odor, with a lot of these. That'll come out, that might come out in 10, 15 years after their indictments and so forth. And then after the indictments, there will be I use the term whistleblowers. That term is rat. You will get informants. Then you'll know. Then you'll find out. Ask me in 20 years.
All right.
I'm alive. Which,
well, hopefully we talk. Hopefully we talk again before that. But yeah.
Yeah. Absolutely. Right. Yeah. Thank you so much for your time. Amazing book. This is definitely you nailed it. Great true crime story. I love all the digging into the details and the periphery of the crime. It was fantastic. Wonderful book. So thank you for writing it.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, there you have it. So, Greg, did we learn anything?
Absolutely, we learned stuff. A lot of things from the past have been reinforced. One of the things was that I can read about a third of a book and still come off like I read the whole damn thing. So I still got it, baby.
Well done. Well done.
But there's all... Thank you. But also, a lot of usual stuff that we've talked about before reinforced. Auditors are bad at catching fraud.
Yep.
Most frauds are unsustainable in the long run.
Yep.
Committing fraud is not easy money. A lot of times you're actually working harder for the stolen money than you would have had to work for honest money.
Yep. Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
So the Crazy Eddie story is interesting because I don't know if you got this sense, Greg, but it eventually crushed him. It crushed Sammy more than anybody, I think. That was my takeaway.
Yeah.
Like Eddie would have gone on forever, I feel like. You pointed out, like, eventually they just got greedy, The IPO was like the big grab, right? They could have kept going with skimming the sales tax and doing insurance fraud and warranty fraud, and they probably could have done that forever. I mean, maybe not forever. Eventually the warranty frauds, I think one of the manufacturers complained about the warranty fraud.
Yeah.
But Gary wrote in the book
I don't think
about
that would have
how
shut him down.
Well, no, I don't know. I mean, it's so funny. You read the book and Gary, the way he explains it, it's like warranty fraud is just something that just happens so frequently that the manufacturers are just like,
right.
There's nothing they can do about it, right? So they may have been able to,
but that's why I think that stuff is sustainable.
Yeah,
because even if you get caught, you're not going to burn alive because of it. You'll just it'll be a slap on the wrist or be like, hey, you guys, knock that off. Kind of thing, or a fine or something like that, or maybe a tiny, but it's not going to collapse your whole organization.
Right.
So I think that stuff was sustainable. But yeah, like you said, and even Gary in his book, he's like, it sounded like Sammy after getting his CPA license and learning all this stuff about accounting, where he goes, hey guys, the scams that we got going down are fine, but they're not. But here's where the golden egg is. So they went after the golden egg, the golden goose, and they ended up failing in that whole thing. So it's the greed. Well, which is always weird, where it's like fraudsters get caught because of greed, and it's like, what else? That's the only thing motivating them is greed. Right. So that's a necessary component. So I always think it's funny when it's like, if these people lying and cheating and stealing hadn't have gotten greedy, and it's like they were from the beginning.
If they had only had just a little bit of self-control.
Right. If it was, moderation in all things, including your greed, I guess. But let me tell you this, though.
Yeah.
To switch gears just slightly.
Shift away.
One of the biggest things I learned, shift away. One of the biggest learning lessons I had from doing this podcast was I learned that it's entirely possible to 100% jinx yourself. We recorded this episode on Friday.
Okay.
And during the episode that you just listened to, you'll remember that I talked about how my day job is I'm part of a building management team for commercial medical office space. And we were talking about the insurance fraud and the floods that happen. I go, yeah, that's just something that happens in buildings. I said that on this podcast on Friday. Saturday morning, 7:30 a.m., I got a call from my maintenance manager saying, we have a flood at the building. It was massive.
No.
It took out 3 floors of office spaces. We're guessing that the damage is around $200,000 worth of damage, but it could be $500,000 worth of damage. We've got 3 doctors' offices that are completely, their offices are a loss. Fortunately, we had some empty space in the building we could move them to temporarily, but it's nuts. And that happened the day after we recorded this damn podcast. So
amazing.
It's the curse of Crazy Eddie. He died in 2016, but either he's haunting me from beyond the grave, or he was like, "Hey, I'm giving you a wonderful opportunity to inflate your insurance claim."
Yeah. So
if you gave you the master class.
So if you're Greg's insurance adjuster, make sure that you're taking notes.
Right. That's right, Seth McClure. You need to listen if you're listening to this podcast. Double check
claims adjuster.
Right. Exactly.
Oh man. Insane. All right. Well, Gary's book again is Retail Gangster: The Insane Real Life Story of Crazy Eddie from Hatchet Books. Again, wherever you get your books, go out and get it. It's a great read.
And that's it for this episode. So remember, if you're weaning off of a fraud, try not to wean onto another fraud.
And also remember, insurance fraud is fine, but the real money is in fraudulent IPOs.
If you want to drop us a line, send us an email at ohmyfraud@earmarkcpe.com. And Caleb, where can people find you out there in the ether?
I'm on Twitter @CNewquist and LinkedIn, full name /Caleb Newquist. Greg, where are you?
I am on also Twitter @Greg Kite, and I'm on LinkedIn, just the /Greg Kite. Also, if you, since my last name is spelled incorrectly, just Google that and you can find pretty much anything you need to know or want to find about me.
Oh My Fraud is written by Caleb Newquist and Greg Kite. Our producer is Zach Frank. If you like the show, leave us a review or share it with a friend. Be sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Spotify, or wherever you listen. And for the accountants out there, CPAs, CMAs, CFMs, if you listen to the podcast on Earmark, you can earn free CPE. Insane. Join us next time for more avarice, swindlers, and scams from more stories that will make you say, "Oh my
fraud. Our frauds are insane."
Crazy Eddie, his prices are insane.